Hello, everyone. I thought I would talk about some of the psychological types out of the portable Jung. So basically, I'm just going to go over extroverted thinking today, and then I'll do other videos on the others because this section is almost like 100 pages. The psychological types is basically from volume 6. So in the portable, it ranges from pages 178 to 269. And yeah, I think it's really interesting to kind of ask not only which psychological type am I, but when are we each of these types? Because there might be like more dogmatic types, more introspective types, etc. And I think that in different circumstances, with different people, with different subjects, we can range all of these types. And Jung makes it very clear that whatever the inverse is of our type, whatever types we are not dominantly or typically, those are still a part of us. And they're probably a part of us that are in the unconscious and in an infantile and regressive state that we need to nurture to become a whole person. Because Jung's idea of enlightenment is to be an expansive personality that shows balance, that doesn't really get taken into the demands or the destructive tendencies of the unconscious, which the unconscious only becomes destructive when we become too one-sided in our conscious selves. So I think it's really important to learn about all the types, not only to understand each other and how to communicate better with people that we come in contact with who might not be the same type as us, but to maybe look out for the types that trigger us, knowing that most likely every time that we are triggered, it's a projection of something that we ourselves are repressing and that exists in the shadows. So with that, I'm just going to go over really quickly what the types are. So there are extroverted types, there are introverted types, and within each, there are 4 different categories, and those categories are thinking, feeling, which Jung says are the rational categories, the categories of judgment. And you'll see that in their more like extreme, less conscious sides. Or maybe I shouldn't say less conscious, more extreme one-sided sides. And then there's sensation and intuition, which are more experiential and empirical. So he talks about all of the categories, so the 4 categories of extroversion, as being focused on the object or external guides, and all 4 categories, thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition, on the introverted side, as being focused on the subject, the subjective, and looking at inner guides. I think that Jung definitely has a bias when he's talking about these. And, he is very interested in healing pathologies. And so I think that he focuses more on the sort of, I don't want to say negative because I think that can get confusing because he uses negative and positive in kind of it's like a theoretical philosophical way. But yeah, like just know that I'm just saying like negative is like disparaging or something that is undesirable. So it's, in a sense, it's hard to see the redeeming qualities in almost any of these types, but especially the ones that Jung feels are already celebrated and dominate society and culture. And so he wants to swing the pendulum back toward the types that he sees are not celebrated enough and are not yeah, I guess celebrated enough is fine. So he talks about in each of these the sections the attitude of consciousness and the attitude of unconsciousness. Because again, whatever we are, whenever we're too extreme or one-sided in what we are, the other types, the inverse of what we are, within our unconscious will arise, but it will arise in not an enlightened and educated way to compensate. It'll sort of be in a childish way. So I think basically whenever we become sort of reactive in dealing with each other, maybe those reactions are rooted in fear. I think fear is really the root of most emotions. Like sometimes when we're angry, we're really just scared, and so on. So I forgot what I was saying. Oh, so when we do that, that is our undeveloped unconscious coming out. So, if ever you've said, I'm so embarrassed, I didn't act like myself today. That's probably but that's a great teacher, right? Because that's a signal, that's a sign that, hey, here's something that you've been neglecting about yourself that you need to explore and develop to align with the age that you actually are. So yeah. So I'm going to start on page 185 when he has kind of passed his introduction and really talking about extroversion. And the first sort of quote that jumped out at me is when he's talking about what the extrovert in general, so before we get to the extrovert thinking, the extrovert in general, their danger, whether they are thinking, feeling, sensation, or intuition. He says, this is the extrovert's danger. He gets sucked into objects and completely loses himself in them. The resultant functional disorders, nervous or physical, have a compensatory value as they force him into an involuntary self-restraint. So if the extrovert can get really interested in the external world and external ideas, of tradition, of culture, of society, in relationships with people, if people are seen as objects in a way. Um, the uh, the extrovert is social then, but maybe too much focused on the external world, and something will happen, Jung says, maybe like a psychosomatic illness or just a mistake or an accident that the person has that will help the person or force the person really into the solitude to perform inner work that they have been neglecting. So Jung really seems to say that if we want to avoid any sort of these psychosomatic illnesses, accidents, anything unnecessary, um, we should continually try to strike a balance, and a balance between our conscious and our unconscious, the external world, working, going to the grocery store, dealing with our family, relationships, etc. And like inner spiritual work, meditating, doing yoga, being in nature, reading books, etc. So the second quote I'm going to go to is on page 187. So if you have this, you can also mark them down. The attitude of the unconscious as an effective complement to the conscious extroverted attitude has a definitely introverting character. So if you are an extrovert, then there is a big part of you that deals in introversion. And whenever you're frustrated or there is an upset in life where you're kind of pushed off track, then the ways that you might react or act out might be the regressive introverted part of you that you have not been attending. It concentrates the libido on the subjective factor. So subjectivity is connected with introversion for Jung. That is, on all those needs and demands that are stifled or repressed by the conscious attitude. As may be gathered from what was said in the previous section, a purely objective orientation, which is the extroverted orientation, does violence to a multitude of subjective impulses, intentions, needs, and desires, and deprives them of the libido that is their natural right. Man is not a machine. And the next one is on page 188, which talks about what I've been saying about the unconscious, like becoming destructive and why that is. So I just want to make clear that the unconscious is not always destructive. Like Jung feels that the unconscious is a reservoir of wealth and knowledge and guidance. And for us to have an expansive personality, we need to create a conversation and a dialogue, a path between the conscious and the unconscious, and have that be a part of ourselves. Because a lot of us are led by the conscious part of the self, the ego, but there is more to us than that. And that is found in the unconscious. Because remember, for Jung, there in the unconscious, there is the personal, and then there is the collective unconscious. Both very helpful. From these general considerations, it is easy to see why the unconscious demands of the extrovert have an essentially primitive, infantile, egocentric character. And that's going to be true for anybody. The unconscious demands of the introvert also have a primitive, infantile character. It would just be more their inverse of the extrovert. His adjustment to the objective situation and his assimilation to the object prevent low-powered subjective impulses from reaching consciousness. These impulses, thoughts, wishes, effects, needs, feelings, take on a regressive character according to the degree of repression. The less they are acknowledged, the more infantile and archaic they become. The conscious attitude robs them of all energy that is readily disposable, only leaving them the energy of which it cannot deprive them. So there's another quote about the destructive character. I mean, Jung focuses mostly on this. It is an outstanding peculiarity of unconscious impulses that when deprived of energy by lack of conscious recognition, they take on a destructive character. And this happens as soon as they cease to be compensatory. So I haven't gotten to exactly the thinking part yet. I think that's next. This is just more of an introduction to extroversion. And if you get too extroverted, too extreme, objectively, rationally, judgmentally extreme, then, your childish nature is going to eventually come out. And what else did I want to say about that? Oh, it's kind of like, I guess, God forbid, like a child who is maybe you are busy and you're not paying as much attention to your kid as you should. And the child starts acting out in bad ways because they just want attention, right? And so sometimes when, or even we can think of ourselves as little kids. Sometimes when we were good, we could still be ignored, right? Like even sometimes our parents would use that as an excuse. Oh, um, little Sarah, she is so good. I never have to bother with her, right? Well, little Sarah probably wants to be bothered with, right? She wants attention from her parents. And so maybe little Sarah is going to, I don't know, start pushing kids at school or knocking down her bowl of cereal off the table because when she's bad, she has to be attended to, right? And so I think that this is why our unconscious acts the way it does in kind of this childish reactive character, because otherwise it's not getting our attention. Okay, so going on to the thinking part, my first quote is on page 194. So this is where Jung gives a hint of his social commentary. And his commentary is that he's biased against extroverted types, I think, from this quote. I am fully aware that our age and its most eminent representatives know and acknowledge only the extroverted type of thinking. So I think we could even say that society would be most celebratory of extroverted people. And I don't know if we would say this today or not, but Jung, I feel, would say that in his time. But looking at specifically thinking now, as opposed to sensation and intuition and feeling. Feeling is next, I guess, after thinking. It's extroverted thinking. And Jung aligns extroverted thinking with scientists, with I think like logical positivism, clear delineations between true and false, truth with a capital T, absolute truths. So he is going to say that Darwin would be a great example of an extroverted thinker. And I think that is because Darwin is a scientist. And he is going to say that Kant would be, and maybe Nietzsche would be good examples of introverted thinkers. So he's going to align introverted thinking with philosophy, just as a heads up when we get there. He says, in this sense, it might be said that the extroverted intellect oriented by objective data is actually the only one that is recognized. So, when there's only one personality or one way of being that is recognized in a society, and Jung has plenty of critiques of his world, focused too much on youth, focused too much on doing, focused too much on neglecting the spiritual. He's going to sort of advocate for the other side. And not the other side like other people, but the other sides of ourselves as human beings, because he really does see us as a collective. So let's see. Okay, so on page 197, if you have it, where it says the extroverted thinking type, he says, when thinking holds prior place among the psychological functions, i.e., when the life of an individual is mainly governed by reflective thinking, so that every important action proceeds or is intended to proceed from intellectually considered motives, we may fairly call this a thinking type. So intellectual motives. Such a type may be either introverted or extroverted. This type of man elevates objective reality or an objectively oriented intellectual formula, this type of man being the extroverted man, the extroverted thinker, into the ruling principle not only for himself, but for his whole environment. By this formula, good and evil are measured and beauty and ugliness determined. Everything that agrees with this formula is right. Everything that contradicts it is wrong. And anything that passes by it indifferently is merely incidental. Because this formula seems to embody the entire meaning of life, it is made into a universal law which must be put into effect everywhere, all the time, both individually and collectively. Just as the extroverted thinking type subordinates himself to this formula, so for their own good, everyone around him must obey it too. For whoever refuses to obey it is wrong. He is resisting the universal law and is therefore unreasonable, immoral, and without a conscience. His moral code forbids him to tolerate exceptions. So we can see how this type can really tend toward a very specific type of dogma. At least I think about, and I know I just said that for Jung, the introverted thinkers are going to be the philosophers, but I think of philosophers, I think of philosophers of rationalism, or like Kant, the categorical imperative. So a lot of times rationalistic, so as opposed to like empirical, but rationalistic arguments of theology. I'm thinking, I guess, even of Descartes. Sometimes they seem really dogmatic and therefore irrational, because it's almost like, to me, when I'm reading it, the philosopher is saying this is the way it is, and to think otherwise would be absurd. I'm like, really? Like, like, hold on here, let's talk about it. I mean, I'm not as convinced as you are. Like, they're convinced with what they said and they're ready to move on, and I'm not. I don't agree. But they think that I've just, reached the pinnacle of logic, and so thus, is true. The proposition, whatever their proposition is. So on the bottom of page 199, all those activities that are dependent on feeling will become repressed in such a type, because the extroverted thinker will have repressed their feeling, their sensation, and their intuition sides. That's not really grammatically correct. Sensate and intuitive sides. Okay. For instance, so he gives examples of feeling. So he says, for instance, aesthetic activities, taste, artistic sense, cultivation of friends, etc. Also irrational phenomena such as religious experiences, passions, and such like are often repressed to the point of complete unconscious. So it gives us a little taste, I guess, of the more experiential, empirical, irrational sides that an extrovert can also be, sensation and intuition. By the way, I think that I'm an intuitive. I don't know if you would use that form of the word, but I just don't know if I am an extroverted or an introverted intuitive, because I haven't gotten to the part in this reading. I haven't finished it yet. So I haven't gotten to the part of the introverted intuitive, but the extroverted intuitive was the first section in this, I guess, chapter that felt like it could remotely be me. I do not feel that I am dominantly this, what I'm talking about, or the feeling or sensation. Like, I couldn't relate to it like at all. Of course, that means that it's probably in my unconscious as a repressed aspect of me. And so I need to explore that. Okay, so he says that when an extroverted thinker maybe gets to an extreme where they're tempted to be less than moral, they can take up the sanction, the end justifies the means. And that's on page 201. So just a few more here. On page 202, he says, as a result of the unconscious personal sensitiveness, it becomes rigidly, or this person could become rigidly dogmatic. The self-assertion of the personality is transferred to the formula. Truth is no longer allowed to speak for itself. It is identified with the subject and treated like a sensitive darling whom an evil-minded critic has wronged. So I think we all know people, or maybe even ourselves, who have certain standards, certain morals, a certain personality and a way of living, a particular character. But then there comes a time where we strangely contradict ourselves and we act out of character and we start moving along a different path. And so how would we explain, or maybe sometimes we are contradictory. So, for instance, how can someone be both continually self deprecating, but then it also seems like they have a very high opinion of themselves, right? So, how can uh, someone be two opposites? And Jung's answer to this is just fairly simple, that they're conscious in their conscious life, they may be, have a very low opinion of themselves. Let's just use my example and be self deprecating, but their unconscious, um, like fights for self-worth. And so it just comes out though, not in a reasonable way, that it doesn't like level up self-deprecation to like having a normal sense of self-worth. It'll compensate and like it'll overcompensate actually. And so it seems like this person is toggling between contradictory extremes, and that's because their conscious self is so one-sided and so extreme that their unconscious, the other side, or the other pole, or the other, yeah, like I guess, yeah, pole of the pendulum or side of the pendulum. Pendulum's like sway from side to side, I guess. Um, the other realm of shouts louder than one will actually end up needing. So even though, let's bring it back to Jung's examples. So even though the extroverted thinker, the objective scientist, is seeking truth, not being held back by any prejudices or subjective biases, but seeking like the objective truth, even though that is the conscious directedness and the true ego, so a true part of the self of this person, um, maybe there will come a time when something triggers them, something upsets them, something frustrates them. And so they become sort of fanatical. Fanaticism is just a characteristic of an extreme level. Um, so they might start to equate what they think is true, which is actually becomes very subjective, which they might not be conscious of. They might not be conscious of, and they might not, and they wouldn't want. Their whole lives are trying to get away from being subjective, because objectivity is certainty, is truth, but they become very subjectively, well, they become attached to subjective truths and they moralize it furthermore. They say that if you don't align with this truth, which is subjective and becomes irrational, even though their whole thing is being rational, then you're an evil person. So I would love if you had any examples of yourself being, oh, I don't want to say like this because I'm focusing on the negative extreme aspects of it. But if you have examples of extroverted thinkers, whether they are on a balanced conscious track or the unconscious is arising, please let me know, because I think it would be really helpful to my evolving understanding of what these types are and trying to figure them out. So basically, this situation where the unconscious roars its childish, regressive head, it usurps the place of all more general, less definite. Oh, actually, maybe this. Yeah, he's still talking about the dogmatism. So it usurps the place of all more general, less definite, more modest, and therefore more truthful views of life. So I think we can even say that in general about someone who's not being, overly reactive or, in a downward spiral for some whatever reason they are in. I think that we could say of the way he's talking about extroversion as focusing on the object, on the external world, in hopes of truth with a capital T, absolute, universal truth that's true for everyone at all times. It ignores truths, maybe that are more subjective or more metaphorical or metaphysical or mythological or religious, that have their own essence of truth. And he says here, it can sometimes be more truthful when you're looking at the essence. Like, I think a good example could be a story that some people, who is we, that some readers clearly see or designate as mythological. That's just mythological, that's creative, it's imaginative, it's made up, it's a story. Versus sort of their boundaried set of truths that they can see, that they can validate, that they can verify, if that means the same thing. Saying something about like the world, earth, nature, etc. Sometimes those mythological stories that are creative and made up can have a deeper, more timeless, more eternal truth. So that's what Jung would say. If you disagree with that, let me know. If you agree with it, let me know. Okay, so this is actually the last quote that I wanted to point out. And I think here we're going to one of the few positive, and I mean that in like a very colloquial way, the true admirable characteristics of an extroverted thinker here. The thinking of the extroverted type is positive. And again, that's why I didn't want to use it in the colloquial term, because he's not using it here in the colloquial term. He means productive. So the thinking of the extroverted type is productive. It leads to the discovery of new facts or to general conceptions based on the disparate empirical material. It is usually synthetic too. Even when it analyzes, it constructs, because it is always advancing beyond the analysis to a new combination, to a further conception, which reunites the analyzed material in a different way or adds something to it. Sorry, I was looking at the time. Because I think I said on my short video that I would try to make these videos shorter. And that's what I tried to do by making notes, but I feel like it's not short. I was going to try to make them like 5 minutes long. I don't know if that can happen. Even when it analyzes, it constructs, because it is always advancing beyond the analysis to a new combination, to a further conception which reunites the analyzed material in a different way or adds something to it. A characteristic feature, at any rate, is that it is never absolutely depreciative or destructive, since it always substitutes a fresh value for the one destroyed. So I think that is very admirable and praiseworthy. And I would love if Jung would talk about the healthy version of each of these a little more, but he tends to talk about the unhealthy versions where we can go off track. And yeah, so I don't know if that's very like helpful if we're just trying to figure out who we are. Um, it's kind of disheartening because we find out maybe who we are, but mostly like the shadow aspects of it. But Jung wants us, to he wants to help us. So he has to point out the issues. So yeah, so thank you so much. So that was it. Next time I will talk about extroversion, extroverted feeling, because that's the next part. That's the other rational judging. All of the extroverted types are objective, externally guided types. But thinking and feeling extroversion is rational and judging, as is introverted thinking and feeling. And then sensation and intuition are experiential and empirical. Okay, I will see you all next time. Please talk in the comments below. Add to this conversation. Give me examples. I'm very into examples. Thank you.